whereas my previous thinking about going to church is you either, and granted in total ignorance, was you either seek a friendly congregation or a good preacher. And I didn't, as I said, the congregation wasn't within my realm. I didn't know how to find it. And a good preacher, I already had great teachers, so I didn't feel that need particularly. But so when he talked about the sacrament, I'm thinking, so the sermon can be lousy, the congregation can be cold, but Christ is present and offers himself to you. And I found out about 2 months later where this priest's church was and started going. In the old Gothic cathedrals, I haven't been in any, I've been in one actually, Chartres, but in the old cathedrals, I understand that in many cases, the dome that sits above the pulpit to help for sound to get out also would have a line printed in the inside of the dome, which only the preacher could see, quoting from scripture that says, "Sir, we would see Jesus." In other words, the preacher's job is to get out of the way. And we have to be so, our goal is to be so perfectly aligned with the Lord on the one hand and with the people on the other hand, both of which are acts of love, that God can speak through us.
Hello and welcome to the Anglican Renaissance podcast. My name is Joe. Today I have a guest with me, Father Lawrence Bausch, and we're going to be talking about Forward in Faith North America. Is there anything that you would want to say, introduce about yourself before we start this conversation, Father Bausch?
Sure. I think, one of the questions that it seems to be almost de rigueur for Anglican priests when you're being interviewed by anybody is, how did you become a Christian? It's like uh, that's even more important than any of the church type questions. So, just a brief background of my conversion, if you will, and coming into the church. I was dropped off at the nearest Protestant Sunday school from about ages 8 to 11 when we moved to California from Ohio. And I don't really remember much other than the flannel boards that were used to tell Bible stories. So it didn't have an impact on me. I never did visit the church. We never went to church. But one evening, I think I was 12. A couple of us, we were down in the basement of where the young people met, and I decided I wanted to see the church. Church kind of seemed so mysterious to me, and I remember sneaking up to see the church and was extremely disappointed. There was nothing. Now I would have the word numinous. There was nothing numinous about it. It looked so bland and ordinary. Anyway, I stopped. My parents separated, divorced when I was 13, so I stopped going to church. The only time I actually was in the church was at age 12. I was baptized on Easter in that Methodist church. But that's the only time I was ever there. So a few months later, I was not going. My parents had separated. So, but really, the main spiritual influence from my childhood, which really spoke to my soul and identified a sense of what I was yearning for, was watching the TV program Twilight Zone. Um, Often the episodes would remind me that there was something better than here. There was something more than here. And in that place that was more than here, there would also be ultimate everything being set right. Uh, all the injustices, all the problems we had would be set right. So that spoke to me. And by the time I was 15, I had gotten enough friends to be able to say, I'm an agnostic. And so I remained a rather strident agnostic, but an agnostic who was seeking. And so when I went to college in San Diego, I became ultimately a philosophy major. And a couple months, or no, a year or so into that, San Diego State, where I was going, started a religious studies department. And so, again, in my role or my life as an active agnostic, I wanted to study religion. So I took courses in Hindu scriptures, Chinese scriptures, almost anything but the Bible, because I, so to speak, knew that from the flannel boards. and I had already dismissed that, so it wasn't really an option. At the same time as I was majoring in philosophy and taking also religious studies classes, I this was back in the days of the draft, which young people don't remember, fortunately. But anyway, all of us at 18, all of us males at 18, had to put our names in, sign up for the draft. And I immediately applied for a deferment, not as a student, which I could have done, but as a conscientious objector, which I believed myself to be. Which what I meant by that is I was willing to serve and help happily serve my country for 2 years, but I would do so as a civilian, not as a military person, either as a combatant or as a non-combatant. Sure enough, I got that deferment, and so I got drafted after my second year of college. So I tried to mix and match classes and full-time job that was finally accepted. And when I'm going back a minute, my father died in a car accident when I was 15. So I had Social Security that I could collect as long as I was taking 12 units of college, and this was until I was 22. So I was able to mix and match and do that. So I was a full-time volunteer working with senior citizens in the poorer part of San Diego, most of whom were African American, although some were Hispanic. And it was there that I met my first, that I could identify real Christians for whom being a Christian made a difference in their daily life. And so that's happening at the same time I'm studying, and ultimately came to, through my studies of other scriptures, came to believe that there was probably some kind of a God. There had to be a power behind all of this. And then I put that together with Kierkegaard, whom I was reading, and he had the insight that to really have faith is not a matter of understanding enough to, as it were, fit God into our brains, but it has to be understanding yourself even better than that to know that you'll never be able to understand everything. And therefore, what's required is what he calls the leap of faith. But it's not a leap of faith with your eyes closed. It's with your eyes wide open, knowing that you're never going to see everything. So I ultimately took that step. Went right shortly about a month after I had turned 21. And after that point, Jesus being the one to whom I prayed, I still hadn't read the Bible, other than remembering a few of those stories. And I was, of course, willing to go to church. That's what Christians did, most of them. But since these two Christians I knew, Mr. Ivy Caffey and Mrs. Marguerite King, were both over 3 times my age and black, I wasn't sure if I could go to a church where they went. They went to different churches, in fact. And the only ones my age I knew, I didn't have any connection with. There was one man who called me up and he mispronounced my last name, which is very easy to do, but he went on to claim to know my deepest need. And my deepest need, of course, was for Jesus Christ, but he didn't ask how to pronounce my name. And so therefore, I'm not gonna trust him. He doesn't know me. How can he claim to know my deepest need? Now, theologically, I'd say, yes, he did, but he didn't know me, and he wasn't interested in me. So how is that going to connect? So anyway, um, my religious studies department at San Diego State had a guest speaker once a month, and after I had been a praying Christian for about 6 months, we had a man on campus who was an Episcopal priest, and his talk was called Principles of Sacramental Living. And I still, I think, have the blue mimeograph paper copy of that from over 50 years ago. And he talked about how, first of all, creation is good. That automatically set him apart from some of the more fundamentalist Christians who seem to treat the world like it's a big minefield. We just have to be careful where we walk. um, and how humankind is good because we were created in the image of God. So, okay, we're not totally depraved. We're not, aimless and without any help or hope. And then how also because we were created in the image of God. And then the abuse of our freedom caused us to be alienated. And once we lost that fundamental harmony with God and creation, we simply lost, we don't know the way back. It's like if a jigsaw puzzle broke into pieces and threw away the top of the box. And so we don't know how to put it together. We don't know what it looks like. So, with that in mind, then he said, that's the incarnation. Christ came to set it right. And so human nature was redeemed in the person of Jesus Christ. And that even if nobody in the world believes it or takes him up on it and allows him to do his work in them, human nature was redeemed. So our job or our possibility, our hope is to accept that, accept him. So then he said how in the church, this presence of Christ that we get to receive by a sheer act of grace, that Christ, the Christ who can do in us what we cannot do for ourselves, comes to us in the sacrament. And so every week, if not more frequently, we get to receive the body and blood of Christ, which, as it were, strengthens the presence that was given to us in baptism. And so whereas my previous thinking about going to church is you either, and granted in total ignorance, was you either seek a friendly congregation or a good preacher. And I didn't, as I said, the congregation wasn't within my realm. I didn't know how to find it. And a good preacher, I already had great teachers, so I didn't feel that need particularly. But so when he talked about the sacrament, I'm thinking, so the sermon can be lousy, the congregation can be cold, but Christ is present and offers himself to you. And I found out about 2 months later where this priest's church was and started going, started attending with my two roommates, actually. And literally a year later, I was off to seminary. Literally a year later, I was off to seminary. I was just about finishing up with college. So that's how I got to church, and the identification I received through that priest, and I was number 20 something about 30 men he prepared for the priesthood during his ministry. Um, that our identity was that we are Catholic. We just happened to be Catholic in the Episcopal Church or in the Anglican Communion. But our primary identity is Catholic, and for better or worse, that's what we are. And if our church ever ceases to be Catholic, then we cease to be that. We can't stay to that. And I guess the simplest way for me to describe how later I could put that in simple terms is the Chicago Lambeth Quadrilateral that was included in the 1979 prayer book. So that which describes basically scriptures, creeds, sacraments, and ministry, which Anglicans claim to have received. We didn't create them. We have no authority over them. We are only to receive them and practice them faithfully. So that's what, in short terms, it means to be a Catholic Christian.
And so
So
that yeah, sorry.
yeah.
So this would have been you were saying, I'm thinking the start of this story was, I mean, obviously your early life, but then it was during the Vietnam War,
Hmm.
which yeah, people are always surprised to hear. But my dad was very old when I was born, so he was eligible for the draft in Vietnam as well.
Uh-huh.
And he talks a lot about it. I know lots of people. I don't know a single person who has talked about that time period as not having a strong impact on them and thinking about meaning and God even. And it seems like that was a part of your journey as well. I mean, you were a conscientious objector, and then you
Hmm.
found meaning in a deeply rooted sacramental Catholic worldview,
Hmm.
and then became a priest.
Yeah, I went off to my thought was I'd go to graduate work in philosophy and end up teaching, and this came about, and that itself, my vocation, to give you a brief bit, my sense of vocation was actually rooted in sin. Um, I was about to be confirmed. It was at Christmas break, and I was going to be confirmed. My confirmation was delayed until January because I was taking GREs in November, graduate record exams, so I couldn't go when the bishop was coming to the parish. So I was about to be confirmed, was home in LA for Christmas break, went to a church, and unlike most visitors, I sat near the front. And that meant I was one of the first to receive communion. It was a church, first time I'd been to a church that had a freestanding altar. So the priest was facing the congregation. And so I had said my prayers after receiving communion, and then I looked up and I saw the priest and the acolytes just simply, doing the ablutions, cleaning the vessels and so on. And I found myself very critical. I said, "Oh, he's being terribly theatrical about that. I would not do that." And immediately I repented. I was surprised at my being so judgmental of something I knew absolutely nothing about. So I repented. I you know, made my amends, if you will, with the Lord over all of that. But this was on a Sunday, and the following Friday, I'd always was going to a Friday morning 9:30 mass, and I would be starting as an acolyte there once I was confirmed in a couple of weeks. So, but I went there, and for whatever reason, this sin that I had repented of, and I knew it was hardly a mortal sin. It was hardly a sin at all, but it was a sin, me being judgmental. It haunted my conscience. And so I asked the priest, I said, "This is gonna sound ridiculous, but could I, talk to you for a little bit after the coffee hour on this Friday?" And he said, "Sure." So I went in and I told him about it. And he said, "Well, why would you want to be a priest?" I said, "No, no, that's not it at all. It has nothing to do with this." So he said, "Well, I want you to pray about this, and I want you to ask why the Lord might be calling you to be a priest, and let me know when you're ready to talk." It took me a month. I prayed about it every night. I did a self-examination. I was praying every night, and it took me a month before I was willing to even pray about it. And I don't need to maybe go into the rest of the story, but that's how it started. It started in sin, just as initially I didn't mention, but my conversion itself, when I started praying as a Christian, that too was rooted in a great disappointment and misunderstanding in a personal relationship. So I'm accustomed to God getting my attention when I'm doing something wrong. So,
For sure. So then, did you go to a specific seminary?
yes, my priest wanted me to go to Nashotah House, but the bishop said that we already had a seminarian there from the same parish, and he thought we needed to get a broader spectrum. So I was given a choice between one in New York City and one in Chicago. My father had left Pennsylvania and grown up in Chicago. I'd been to Chicago. New York seemed too intimidating, so it was to Chicago I went. Seabury Western, it was called, actually in Evanston, Illinois. So
Cool. So this would have been in the 1970s then.
yeah, I started in 1971. Mhm.
Okay, yeah. So tell me a little bit about, I mean, knowing the history of the Episcopal Church, you're coming into the denomination kind of during a struggle, a moment. I mean, I don't know if you were aware of it at the time, but between um, a kind of a nascent liberalization and traditional, what we would call Catholic Christians.
Right.
What was that like? Were you aware of that? Did you participate?
Yeah, I was aware of that. One of the things that I had come to admire about Anglicanism is that by focusing its center beliefs, as in that Chicago Lambeth Quadrilateral, on those things which were believed and practiced within the first 5 centuries of Christianity, and certainly before this division of East and West, those were the things that Anglicanism considered essential. And other things about which we would have opinions, we were free to disagree. So Anglicanism was a comprehensive form of Catholicism, unlike uh, at times the Roman Catholic Church that focuses on who's out as often as who's in. Vatican II changed some of that, but that was still new at that time. So I liked the idea of being comprehensive. You don't want to focus on secondary things and make them essential. So I appreciated that and the struggle that that means that we have because we're not always going to agree on everything. But at the same time, um, that gave me the definition of limits. Are these changes that are going on? At what point do they mean that we've ceased to be Catholic? At which case I could no longer be that. So in 1973, at the beginning of my senior year of seminary, the Episcopal Church did not approve the ordination of women to the priesthood. So I was ordained in a church that did not ordain women. Um, and yet, a month after my ordination to the diaconate in 1974, 11 women went through an ordination service in Philadelphia illegally. And so I had my first interview at the request of my rector at the time to talk about that in 1974. So that was an issue which would change the understanding, not primarily so much of ministry, but also of sacrament, because of our understanding of how sacraments are valid, you might say. You have to have valid clergy, and this raised that question. If women ontologically are not the suitable subject for ordination, then their sacramental acts are not valid. So then, when it was approved in 1976, the ordination of women, I and many of my friends weighed with whether or not we could stay in the Episcopal Church. Had that permanently damaged its Catholicity, at least for its foreseeable future? And most of us said no, although there are some who did, and that's what led to what now would be referred to as the continuum. So, but those of us who stayed, there was never a question of compromise. Uh, so um, then that began to combine with some questionable elements of what became the new prayer book in 1979, and things began to unravel. Yes, we were seeing them unravel, but um, right after the ordination of women and also the first reading of the new prayer book in 1977, there was an organization formed called the Evangelical and Catholic Mission. And those words are equally important. And our primary role, I joined that, our primary role was education. Um, a lot of Anglicans, a lot of Episcopalians at that time, just like many other churches, weren't terribly well trained. There wasn't a lot of adult formation. And so let's get teaching out there and hope that that can have an impact. And that's what we did until 1989. And in 1988, late 1988, I believe, the Episcopal Diocese of Massachusetts, uh, put a woman through the consecration service to become a bishop. And suddenly, when you have a female bishop, again, if it's not ontologically valid, then any man who would be ordained by a woman in this role would not be validly ordained, and it's much harder to distinguish sacramental validity. And so at that point, several Episcopal bishops who were leaders in the evangelical and Catholic mission called for an extraordinary synod in Fort Worth in 1989 to deal with this. And that's when the Episcopal Synod of America became formed. And it was four bishops that did that, the bishops of Eau Claire, Wisconsin, Quincy, Illinois, Fort Worth, and San Joaquin in California. And it was an exciting gathering. It was a very hopeful gathering. And the intention, again, a modest intention, was to ask through the General Convention, the proper channel in the Episcopal Church, to ask for the creation of a 10th province. The Episcopal Church divided into 9 previously, a 10th non geographical province, which would be organized for the purpose of maintaining a male priesthood and episcopate, particularly in the case that, as we believed, the Episcopal Church will eventually discover that this was a mistake to admit women to these ministries, and we would have not lost our sacramental integrity. So that's what we were asking for in two consecutive general conventions, then 1991 and 1994, and it never was able to get out of committee. Uh, the intent was not there. And just as an aside, in 1976, when the Episcopal Church voted for, it did not vote to admit women to the priesthood per se. That would have been a constitutional change, which would have required two consecutive general conventions. Instead, they voted for a canonical change, which only was on one reading, which said, ironically, because of the direction of the 1979 prayer book that was going in, that where the masculine pronoun is used in the ordinal, it is meant generically. That's all they did. And the presiding bishop at the time offered his resignation because he could not support it. And the House of Bishops told him this is a meeting, a special meeting of the House of Bishops after the convention. This is purely permissive in those places where it is deemed pastorally necessary. So you do not need to resign. Well, so that was the intent, and that's one reason why some of us could stay, even though we didn't think it was appropriate. So, yeah, we could see all of this coming, but then they added more things, and ultimately, the issue was not really so much women or later sexuality issues. It was, does the Episcopal Church, which is a small part of a global communion, which is one part of the one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church, does this one little sliver have the freedom to alter the sacraments and ministry of the church, which we have received? It's not ours to tinker with. And so the question, the question has to be addressed that way. It's fundamentally about authority. Do we have the authority to do this? And so as we watch the dominoes continue to fall, as the question of sexuality and priesthood becomes now the question of sexuality and marriage, and goes on and on from there. So we're watching all this happen, and as you probably know, in 1997, at that convention in Philadelphia, the acceptance of the ordination of women went from being allegedly permissive to being mandatory. It was now required in every diocese to allow for the ordination of women to the priesthood, and if the diocesan bishop wouldn't do it, he had to allow for someone else to come in and do it. So at this point, the Episcopal Synod of America, meeting after that convention, and I was a deputy then, um, we realized our future did not lie in the Episcopal Church. There was no hope of a 10th province within the Episcopal Church. And so we put together a statement that's called the Good Shepherd Statement, Good Shepherd Rosemont in Pennsylvania, where we met. Um, it's on the main line outside of Philadelphia. Anyway, we put out a statement which I believe was the first time in print anybody articulated the vision of what we called an emerging Orthodox province in North America, Orthodox Anglican province in North America. And that language caught fire. One of the people that was sitting in with us during our council meeting, by the way, I was elected to Forward in Faith Council at the 94 meeting after that general convention at which I was a deputy. And so one of the men who came was a Southern priest, Father John Schuler, who was more of an evangelical, but he maintained, a traditional faith. Well, he helped us craft language throughout the statement that would also speak to evangelicals because, it's a question ultimately, as I said, of authority, not of strictly things that high church people are interested in, which is why ordination of women is not the centerpiece. It was a flashpoint, but it's not the center of what was going on. So this statement was circulated, and out of this began another little movement called First Promise. And a lot of Southern evangelicals signed on to First Promise, as did many of us who were more Anglo-Catholic. And this First Promise movement was basically saying, recall your first promise to be faithful to the Lord. And that's our marching order primarily as priests in the Episcopal Church. So this helped, and I should have mentioned it was the 97 also our meeting that we changed our name from Episcopal Synod of America to Forward in Faith North America, which would align us with other named Forward in Faith organizations in UK and in Australasia. We were linking arms, although in the long run it turned out our separate circumstances required that we act independently of each other. Uh, so anyway, First Promise though led to some people saying, um, we need to have a missionary movement, uh, and outside, we're still in the Episcopal Church, but it'll be outside, and that's what formed the Anglican mission in America. Um, and at this point, they began to grow rather swiftly. Forward in Faith was well respected because we were the starters, if you will, of this Orthodox reaction to what was going on in the Episcopal Church. And so we all were appealing to overseas primates to see um, for they seek their guidance for when it might be appropriate to start a new province. But we were totally, especially in Forward in Faith, we were not going to do anything without the support of the primates. AMIA, in the meantime, they got the idea that or discernment, I guess, that, and I should say that the primates said to AMIA and to Forward in Faith, each of you should give us two names of potential bishops so that if that time comes, we'll know what to do. So we chose our two names and they chose their two names. And nothing happened until uh, and I should say in this period of time too, the 1998 Lambeth Conference occurred, at which the Great Coalition of Global Primates put out a very strong sexuality statement uh, that was widely celebrated among traditional Anglicans around the world. Um, anyway, then the AMIA got two primates to agree to consecrate their two men. So the province of Southeast Asia and the province of Rwanda consecrated two men to be bishops for the AMIA, they being Father Chuck Murphy and Father John Rogers. And so they became bishops, and that caused havoc. Um, it broke fellowship among the global primates because these two acted without consulting the others, and that made it very difficult. And then it put everybody else Forward in Faith. Certainly, we were caught empty-handed. We didn't know what to do, and it seemed so inappropriate. So that went on for a while, and it took a while for the global primates to heal their fellowship after this rift. Um, but ultimately, what they finally said to us in America in terms of our new province is you need to come to us with one voice. We can't keep trying to deal with you here and there, and because this is what happened. Look at the MIA. We can't do this piecemeal. It has to be a whole thing. So they challenged us to come up with a faith statement that they could accept, or that they could read at least, and see if they could address that. So we formed what's called the Common Cause Roundtable, and this roundtable worked for some time. It had members from the Continuum, from the REC, from the Episcopal Church, from AMIA, Forward in Faith. All of the different groups came together to put together this faith statement. And we finally did it successfully. And it was presented to the primates, and they gave us the green light. And it was on that basis that GAFCON in 2008 was able to give us the go ahead to start a new province. And that statement that the Common Cause Roundtable put together is now it's in our new prayer book. Uh, when you look at the historic documents, you'll read it there. That's our fundamental declaration. And so all of us were able to come together. Now, the Continuum, who had participated in the roundtable, chose not to go because they believed we were still permanently compromised by the presence of women in the priesthood coming into the ACNA. But the REC chose to come in, and they are, as it were, in but not of the ACNA because of their separate history. And then the rest of us did. And when you asked about the Forward in Faith uh, contribution for all of that, in 2006 and 7, after the 2006 General Convention, that's the one at which Catherine Jefferts Schori was elected to be the new presiding bishop of the Episcopal Church, which she was the most outspoken uh, radical, uh, not only being a female, just being a radical. And she had served as a diocesan bishop in the Diocese of Nevada, which had fewer people in it than Christ Church Plano as a parish. So, so she did not have a very big sounding board, but she was the one to stick it to everybody else. And it was definitely not only will we not repent for the Gene Robinson affair, but we're going to go full steam ahead. And that's when people like me and many others started leaving. And the four dioceses that left were the three dioceses by that time whose bishops were Forward in Faith bishops: Quincy, San Joaquin, and Fort Worth, and the fourth bishop was Bishop Duncan in Pittsburgh. Now, I mentioned the 1997 General Convention in Philadelphia. AMIA was working with, or excuse me, Forward in ESA was working with Episcopalians United to help the deputies who were there who were Orthodox. So Episcopalians United, I think that's what they were called then, put on a daily lunch, a free lunch for deputies, at which we could get updates on committee actions and what was coming up legislatively that we needed to know about. And Forward in Faith put on a daily mass in the morning, a mass and a little coffee hour. So when we did that, one of the bishops who came every morning was Bishop Duncan, who was a brand new bishop in Pittsburgh. And even though he had a different position than ours on women in priesthood, he knew that we were his friends. And so we came, and in fact, on one of the later days, he was invited to be the celebrant, and he asked me to be his acolyte. So, anyway, the Forward in Faith connection at the beginning of what would become the new province, we were, as it were, a major part of the skeleton of that, with our three dioceses and then Pittsburgh. And so then, as we spread out, adding the REC, which totally holds the traditional position on holy orders, and then we began to divide out and form the Anglican Communion Network, which led to a bunch of new dioceses and so on. Anyway, that's our contribution to leading up to the structure of the new province. And so the question today, I think, is in some ways, we now have the luxury, in a sense, of um, being able to go back to the work of the ECM, which is largely education. Uh, that if we can teach, uh, and I can say personally, there's at least a bishop and several priests I know in the ACNA who came to a changed position on holy orders and other things just because of conversation and sending them back to the scriptures. Um, so that's where I believe we have a contribution to still make today, not just on that issue, but on the whole question of Catholicity and what are our boundaries in our comprehensiveness.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think totally right to say that there are other topics. Of course, the ordination issue is an important issue, I think, for lots of people. I get people who message me all the time asking about what to do, and I recommend them to Forward in Faith, because I think this organization is, if you are Catholically minded ACNA Anglican, it's an approved channel for advocating for traditional, the traditional view within the Anglican Church in North America. Forward in Faith has delegates that go to Assembly and Synod. It's one of the constituent organizations, like you said. Quincy,
Yeah.
San Joaquin, and Fort Worth were all Forward in Faith dioceses, which formed the ACNA. What is the? I mean, you touched a little bit on this. What is the future role for FIFNA within the province and even maybe in the communion um, today?
That's a good question. Some of it, as you said, we are embedded in the ACNA, not only because of bishops who are members, but also because the organization itself is one of two ministry partners that have representation with voice and vote on the executive council of the ACNA. Both Forward in Faith and the American Anglican Council have those uh, uh, privileges, if you will. So we're not some outside, you know, agency that's trying to have an impact. We're respected at the center. Um, I think that our impact, again, we're getting so many people, and I have met so many young people in particular coming into Anglicanism from the evangelical world or the free church or non denominational world, that this is particularly where Forward in Faith can be helpful because of our ministry of education. Um, I think that one of the issues that's come up, well, I serve as an examining chaplain for the ACNA West, which includes a number of dioceses, and we read exams of potential ordinands. And we have come up with the realization that in addition to the seven canonical areas that need to be examined in, we've added an eighth, which is ecclesiology. Um, the nature of the church is something that a lot of people that I've met who are coming in from evangelicalism, either to be priests or lay people, um, they may come in with a true desire to be part of the historic church, and to be a place where sacraments are respected and honored. But a lot of times there's a weak spot in their understanding that has to do with the communion of saints and ecclesiology generally, that the body of Christ is a lot more than just the gathered people from today. And therefore, like Chesterton once said of tradition, it's the democracy of the dead, that they have voice and vote. And in fact, no one who has been uh, redeemed in Christ is ever dead. They're still alive in Christ. Otherwise, if they're dead and they are in the body of Christ, then Jesus himself is, if you will, the walking dead. Uh, he, they have to be alive, and we again, we stand under them, and that's why, back to the Chicago Lambeth Quadrilateral, why we have to accept that we have no authority to change any of those areas as such a small sliver of the body. So, ecclesiology, what is the nature of the church? Um, I have, from my seminary days, the Oxford Dictionary of the Christian Church that was issued then. If I did this, I looked up ecclesiology. It had to do with church architecture, building. And clearly, you as a young Anglican know well enough that it's a lot bigger than that. And it is one of the issues of the day. And Forward in Faith has the history and the credibility to be able to pass on good ecclesiology, sound ecclesiology. Um, and it's been a real struggle. The ACNA, yes, it's divided over women in holy orders, but it's also divided. Some people, some churches, I understand, consider the Book of Prayer, Book of Common Prayer, to be simply a liturgical resource to be used at will. It has no claim on order of worship or anything like that. So there are a lot of ways in which Forward in Faith can do that teaching. And one reason that I chose not to run for reelection as president after serving for 6 years is that because of our role in the ACNA and our potential, we needed to have a bishop as president. Uh, you know, having a ordinary priest and even worse, a retired priest as the president, that's I'm like a 40-watt bulb instead of a spotlight. And so I was grateful that my good friend Bishop Eric Moniz was willing to be standing for election because that's where we can do our work. He knows the people and he is respected and he respects them. And I think at that level, it helps for the it enables the rest of us in Forward in Faith to not only be praying, but also to be serving in whatever capacity he wishes, so that we can promote uh, the the fullness of the faith, if you will.
Yeah. Always been encouraged by my interactions with the bishops who are involved in Forward in Faith. Bishop Eric Moniz is the president. I had Bishop Daryl Fitzwater on the podcast, and people loved that conversation. We talked in that conversation as well about the importance of the liturgy and the Book of Common Prayer, and why it is sad to see that there are some corners of the ACNA where it is seen as an option. Traditionally, the point of the Book of Common Prayer was that this is the required liturgy that everybody
Right,
has to do,
right.
rather than some kind of suggestion. I think that is an under appreciated, on one hand, underappreciated important aspect of reform within the ACNA that needs to be kind of advocated for. I think it's also partially a consequence of success. Because I think it's the consequence of a lot of people, like you've mentioned already, from evangelicalism coming into the ACNA, becoming ministers, or even just making up huge portions of uh, uh, people in the pews at churches, and they're very unfamiliar with
Hmm.
the Book of Common Prayer tradition. So I think that would be one of the things I hope my channel and these conversations, and also Forward in Faith, can do very well, is to educate people on the importance of it. I think especially in a world where people of my generation didn't really grow up with a strong, liturgical uh, uh, tradition. I know lots of people who grew up in evangelicalism, who had no understanding of really liturgy, or they were very suspicious of liturgy. And I know people who grew up, even say Roman Catholic, who didn't really kind of understand what was going on in the wake of liturgical reforms in that communion. And then just more people growing up today who were never Christian at all. Uh, uh,
Yeah,
so they don't have any point of reference for liturgy. So
yeah.
it's a lot more uh, bottom up understanding that we have to reestablish with new generations of Anglicans. So it's a lot of work to be done,
Right.
but it's good work to do. I think I enjoy doing it when we talk about it on this show.
Oh, that's such a good and hopeful sign. I think in some ways, as I've thought about this, I just recently had my 50th anniversary of my ordination to the priesthood, and in thinking about it, um, I do believe that what I was yearning for as a teenager was something that was not only numinous but transcendent. I needed something more that would be more than me. And I think that that's an intuition that a lot of young people today are tapping into. They want something, they want church to be not just something that they enjoy and like, but something that takes them outside of themselves. And so, an attraction, for example, of many Roman Catholics, well, not maybe too many, but a number of young Roman Catholics for the Latin Mass. These aren't anti-Vatican II people. These are people that realize the church should be a mystery, you know. And after all, if what we believe is true, we experience a miracle every Eucharist. And what should be our response to the miracle? Looking at our watch to see if we're going to be home in time for the game. You know, this is a life-giving miracle. And so the liturgy, for many people, needs to reflect that. And so a sense of the numinous. The priest I was working with not too long ago, who was doing a church plant, and he was teaching me a great deal because I never knew anything about church planting. Um, but he wanted to people, he had decided that the people needed to be oriented in their lives so that they were focused on him, not on God, not on themselves. Church is not there to make you comfortable and happy. It's there to direct you to him and what he's doing, not what you're doing. And so, among other things, he wanted to move the altar against the east wall, liturgical east anyway, to lead the people in prayer, not as they used to say, turn your back on the congregation. You're leading the people in worship, and you want to live an oriented life. And when clergy are doing that, um, and he did it, of course, the right way. He did it by teaching and preparing the people. The other thing or a shortcoming I see in our focus on church planting, to some extent, is um, that the priest gets to do whatever he wants, um, and that's not always good. And a priest who wants to do whatever he wants, that's not good, either. We're there as servants of the servants of God, and so we lead in servanthood. And so, we have to train, the people, to show that we're under him ourselves, and it doesn't begin and end with me. We pass on a living tradition, that sort of thing.
I think one of the uh, hesitancies some more Protestant people have looking at Anglicanism is it seems like we give clergy and bishops all this authority, but really that authority, when it's done right, is subjected to canon law. It's subjected to the Book of Common Prayer, and in a lot of ways, I would say that the average priest in the Anglican tradition, done rightly, is much less of a kind of dictator in his congregation than the average non-denominational pastor who is accountable to nobody but himself. And that's intentional.
Mhm.
So one of the hazards that we do have, I think, with the part of that is the diocesan situation in the ACNA. Part of that is just church planting fervor means that there's new churches being built, every week, literally in the ACNA, and that those new congregations they don't have as much awareness of what the role of the priest is, and they don't have as much awareness of the liturgy, and they're not going to um, understand if the priest changes this or changes that or what, because they don't have a point of reference. And I also think there's some hesitancy even from kind of rules making systems in the ACNA to kind of clamp down on successful mission because it feels like that's the point, right? We're supposed to be uh, uh, taking the word to the world. So, um, there's a lot of factors there, I think, but that I
Yeah.
think you're right that can be lead to a little bit of liturgical chaos and things that
Uh,
we should correct. Yeah.
our bishops definitely need our prayers. I mean, they have to struggle with this and make decisions that we didn't have to, uh, as priests. I was on the governance task force when we were putting together the constitution and canons, to prepare to become a province, and, um, it was almost inevitable that our canons would be somewhat reactionary, because of the suffering that many people experienced at the hands of the Episcopal Church. And so we overstated some things, understated some things, all, I think, in reaction to what we had experienced. But we were able to talk about it, at least among ourselves on the committee, enough to say, well, if we are minimalist also in our reaction, we can't help reacting. But if what we put together is minimal, then it can rest on the next generation to improve it, to make it stronger. And that degree of humility I found comforting, because we have to have that. Again, the whole idea from everything I've been talking about, my whole experience is, you know, we have to suspend our limited understanding and allow God to be greater than we are, um, and therefore a fundamental sense of humility and servanthood. You've probably heard in the old Gothic cathedrals. I haven't been in any. I've been in one actually, Chartres, but in the old cathedrals, I understand that in many cases, the dome that sits above the pulpit to help for sound to get out also would have a line printed in the inside of the dome, which only the preacher could see, quoting from scripture that says, "Sir, we would see Jesus." In other words, the preacher's job is to get out of the way. And we have to be so, our goal is to be so perfectly aligned with the Lord on the one hand, and with the people on the other hand, both of which are acts of love, that God can speak through us. And, we're not up there. I've turned away people who thought they had a vocation to the priesthood when it seemed like these were people who were so socially inept that they simply wanted somebody to listen to them. And that would be a way they would get an audience, and that's just sad. Um, so we have that obligation, I think.
Yeah. So as we kind of land the plane here, I think one of the phrases that always stuck with me when talking about reform in the ACNA and different issues that we've touched on today is we can overestimate what ought to be done in a year and underestimate what we can do in 10 years or in 20 years or in a generation.
That's a good point.
What do you see as kind of the trajectory of the ACNA? Where do you see the ACNA in 10, 20, 30 years? Where do you see Forward in Faith playing a role in that trajectory?
Well, I guess the first thing to say is that I hope there is an ACNA in the next 10 to 20 years. Um, I was cautioned by a dear friend of mine, a holy priest, when we left the Episcopal Church, which in our case was 2006. Um, I was cautioned that leaving a church is like leaving a marriage, which is to say, once you've done it once, it's a lot easier to do it a second time. Um, and we wrestled, as I told you, our parish and me personally, I wrestled with whether or not to leave for 30 years. Um, and I was reading the letters of Evelyn Underhill to at the time in 1976 when I was praying about whether or not to leave. And so I took her letters again on a retreat in 2006 when I was praying about whether or not to leave. And what she said in one of her letters, because she was responding to somebody asking why she didn't just become Roman Catholic. And she said, well, um, it's like if you're a faithful churchgoer, and even more so, I would add a priest, you're like serving on the front lines. And you're not at liberty to leave your post just because things are getting tight, things are getting hot and uncomfortable. But the more crucial thing she said was, as long as you are able to do the work you are called to do where you are, then you mustn't leave. If it ever reaches the point where you cannot do what you are called to do where you are, then you must leave. And I saw God's answer to me to be the first in 1976 and to be the second in 2006. And that's when I knew I had to leave. I could no longer do the work I was called to do. Now, I'm saying by that that that's true for any other priest. I have several good friends who are still serving in the Episcopal Church, and I pray for them. It's certainly not easy for them. And how long they're going to last, that's between them and the Lord. I don't know, but we as long again we it's never going to be taking ourselves too seriously because we are part of, so to speak, the Lord's army, uh, and those images apply to where we are, I think.
Yeah. So, I think you alluded there to some divisions within the ACNA, maybe potentially becoming uh, potential fissure points in the future, and hoping that they don't become fissure points. I think also earlier about the conversation that had with the continuing churches, where they felt like there was compromises being made by FIFNA, maybe the REC, by
Hmm.
participating in ACNA. What do you see as the justification for remaining within the ACNA, even though we hold to the traditional view on holy orders? Why is that a good and commendable thing still
Yeah.
today?
Well, when we were first leaving and first linking arms with Bishop Duncan, let's say, as one of the dioceses that left, and as others were being formed that had women in them, and as women were joining into this separated movement. And the AMIA, by the way, which started in opposition, they would not have women priests. But what they did, my understanding is, they allowed for those women who were part of the AMIA, who had already been ordained, to be, as it were, grandmothered in. So they would, my understanding is, they would not function as priests anymore, but they could retain their position, function as deacons, and so on. But that didn't last. There was a break off within the AMIA. So, it's a constant kind of challenge. But I think, what we have to say is that we hope that because we're dealing with faithful Christians in the ACNA, which was not always the case as a way that we could recognize in terms of those fundamentals um, in the Episcopal Church, then as it were, the winning of the hearts and minds, the teaching becomes more important. And presumably, as Christians, as Orthodox Christians, we're all teachable. And so it's worth doing. And so our cavalier remark to some of even our members who wondered what we were doing, if out of the frying pan into the fire, uh, no, this time we're dealing with Christians. That was sort of the glib answer. But I think there's truth to that. I mean, none of us, I don't know anybody in the ACNA, no matter how deep disagreements I have with them, I don't know anybody I don't trust as a brother or sister in Christ. So that makes it worth doing. And because I think, to me, this is the good side of being comprehensive, that we can indeed have difference of opinion. However, because of that, we are not, the ACNA is not truly a church. It's an ecumenical fellowship because we do not have reciprocity among clergy. And until that is resolved, and unless that is resolved, we won't. But that doesn't mean we should stop being in dialogue with each other, respecting one another, and so on. Um, that has to be, for me, that's the challenge. And it's like my friend cautioned, yes, it might seem easier to leave, but that's really not. Again, as long as we can do the work, as long as I can do the work I'm called to do, I'm not at liberty to leave. Nothing is preventing that. Um, but we hear rumors of some of the people in the ACNA wanting to have women as bishops, as well as the ones who say, if this doesn't get resolved soon, we should just break off. So, and I have no sense of timing, although I can probably say at my current age that I'm not going to be around to see.
Who knows? I hope not. I mean, I hope that the path forward is reform and not a kind of breaking apart of the ACNA.
Yeah.
I think there are trends that are noticeable. There was an Anglican Inc. article that has shown that there are fewer and fewer female ordinands in the ACNA every year. I think part of that is, not for nothing, it's a little bit of a shrinking demographic of people who support the ordination of women but do not support gay marriage over time,
Hmm.
because it's becoming more of a bifurcated issue of change and what we might call liberalization. I think there are reasons to be hopeful for reform. I think there are other discouraging things that may or may not have happened. But I also think you're right to point out that the ACNA, for better or for worse, is actually really a very loose set of a collection of dioceses that don't have the same kind of uh, coherent church structure that traditionally provinces within the Anglican Communion have had, or in Christian history have had. Um, Most of the issues come down to canons that are individual per diocese. So it's um, in some senses less unitary than the Episcopal Church, and in other senses, though, we have an archbishop. Which, if you're like a canon lawyer person or interested in the difference between a metropolitan and then the presiding bishop, which they have in the Episcopal Church, that
Hmm.
actually is a more significant position. Um, but it's also almost a little bit of a title of courtesy, given the fact that he doesn't necessarily have some of the
Right,
canonical prerogatives that traditional archbishops would have had.
right. Yeah, I think in some sense, because of Anglicanism's inherent um, tolerance or diversity, then the question always is this proposed change something that is essential or is it something that is not essential? And how you discern that. And that depends largely, I think, on one's implicit ecclesiology. What is the nature of the church? For example, on uh, ministry, um, when Anglicanism decided uh, that men could be married and still be priests, that set them against the medieval practice of the Roman Catholic Church, but in common with the Eastern Church. And therefore, it was perceived that this change was not essential. Um, is the change to add women to the priesthood essential? That's where the argument has to be. I wrote a paper some years ago for a group on the sacramental validity of women in orders, and I tried to demonstrate. And a friend of mine who read it, a young priest, said what he liked about it is that it was ontological. It wasn't transactional, it wasn't functional, it wasn't relational. It simply has to do with the nature of humanity and God in relationship to humanity and male and female being complementary. Um, that's the kind of thing that has to be looked at. It's always humorous to look at how the media understands the Roman Catholic Church, which is very poorly. Um, they can only read it through their own secular values, and therefore they don't get any of it about their morality. They don't understand abortion. They don't understand women in holy orders. There's so many things they don't understand. Um, but it's our job to try to make sure our people in our churches understand what these things mean. And so again, going back to the teaching and the modeling role. Um, you're probably aware there was a really, I think, a very fine book put out last year called Reformed Catholic Anglicanism, um, based on a conference, the Anglican Way Institute conference that was done through the REC a couple of years ago. But the seminal articles in that book are by Bishop Sutton, Hans Boersma, Gerald McDermott, and Greg Peters, and they are all sound and solid. Oh, and Barbara Gauthier is in there as well, along with Jerry McDermott. These are the kinds of things. If we can put out things like that, McDermott's book on deep Anglicanism, uh, Boersma. One of my favorites of his is Five Things Theologians Wish Biblical Scholars Knew, uh, which is it's really good on ecclesiology. So it's things like that. We just have to keep doing what we're doing, and as people have been saying for a long time, our job is to be faithful, not successful. Uh, that's God's business, and we have to learn, to allow suffering as we experience it, even in the church. It's up to us to decide whether it's going to be punitive or redemptive. So, in other words, would you rather be in hell or in purgatory? That's up to you. And if we're willing to allow it to be purgatorial, then, God will do his work through our suffering. Um, I think the general tendency is for the more conservative minded uh, to err on the side of rule and order. They would rather be right. And the liberal or progressive error is they would rather be welcoming and being compassionate, they would call it, for others. But that can lead to a compromise of the truth, even as the conservative can lead to a compromise of the love. Uh, Everybody I've talked to about the recent papal election suggests that perhaps Leo the 14th has a good combination of both, that he has the compassion and the experience and the desire to reach out to the poor and marginalized, but also his namesake, and Leo the 13th. Not only did he do that, but also he reintroduced with vigor the teaching of St. Thomas Aquinas. So theological clarity as well as pastoral uh, expression, somehow keeping them both together. And every one of us, it's like, I don't know if you have children, but my wife and I raised four children, and we're always going to err either on the side of being overly strict or overly permissive, and often with the same child. So we just have to learn to live with that. And thankfully, as they grow up, then we learn to apologize for the mistakes we made and love each other through those mistakes. So if we can do that, then perhaps 20 years from now, we will still be together in the ACNA. If not, then I don't know. I don't know what's going to be next. But frankly, this issue of this comprehensiveness of Anglicanism, it's really about Anglicanism as a whole. Is that model of focusing on unity in essentials and disagreement in non-essentials, because the question is always, where is the dividing line? Is it sustainable? But if you can only stay together under strict rules, then is that sustainable? So anyway.
Yeah. No, it's a tension that I mean, I pray you're right about about Pope Leo being a good balance between charity and truth. I hope and pray that God raises up leaders within the ACNA who can make that balance. And
Mhm.
I think that Forward in Faith North America is a good vehicle for people who are trying to strike that balance and to do that well, and who believe in a real unity on the essentials, but then on the other hand, the permission on non-essentials and being able to make those distinctions um, is a difficult skill. It's a difficult skill. I think, in my humble opinion, I do believe that the Anglican tradition does that well, does it better than any other tradition. So, I hope that our province can kind of do the same in the spirit of the Anglican tradition. Yeah,
Well, that's good to hear. And
yeah.
like I say, when we hear things like that from young Anglicans, that's extremely encouraging to those of us who are not so young. Uh,
I think
because,
not for nothing. I hope this interview was really interesting for me because I think a lot of young Anglicans, not for nothing, don't understand the history as well of what's been going on in the province. They just come into the ACNA or some other Anglican church, and they just kind of receive it as is, and don't really understand, why is this that way? Why is that this way? Um, uh, I mean, that can be about the liturgy, but that could also just be about the province of the ACNA and the canons and the diocesan situation. And it can be really helpful just to understand, how did we get to where we're at right now, and why are we here? What was the attitude about the splits that exist? Were they trying? Who was trying to mend them? Who was fomenting them? So I hope that this conversation was helpful for people in the audience. It was certainly helpful for me. Is there anything else you want to touch on before we wrap up the conversation?
um, let me think. Well, I think I'm so grateful again for what you are doing, because a part of the thinking in our past has been, and you point out the centrality of the congregation, which is sometimes as far as people go with our understanding of the church. I had a godly bishop who I served under for many years, and he didn't. He thought we should not tell people in the pews what was going on at a general convention or with the larger church because, as he would say, it's not going to happen here. But the danger with that kind of parochial thinking is that that's no protection uh, to prevent it from happening here. And in fact, it did happen here, as it were, in that particular case. And so, although it's easier to let people think that the church is just what you do at St. Whoever's, um, we really do need to help people to appreciate the body of Christ. And that can also take away some of the mystique of thinking that we have to always be right or that we are always right. Um, and being in dialogue is beneficial to us. You know, it's like just because a married couple never argues doesn't mean that they're having a healthy relationship. You know, sometimes it's getting it out that enables you to get past an impasse. So, you know, what you're doing by providing opportunities for people to learn more, I think when that is shared in a larger way by all of our churches, that can only help us. It won't interfere.
Definitely. I mean, that's the hope with this channel and with Anglican Renaissance in general is mostly just, um, especially being a platform for conversations, but also just the videos that I do, just that people can know what is the tradition that we've inherited. What is, what have we received from the apostles,
Right.
um, to believe. Um, and it's up to the people who listen or to accept or reject that teaching. But nonetheless, they will either accept or reject it at that point,
Right.
and they can even know what they're accepting or rejecting, which I find a lot of times people really, frankly, don't even know what are Christians saying? What
Mhm.
do we believe? What have we always believed? I have lots of conversations with people who either were briefly Christian as a child and maybe taken to church a couple times, and they think that they completely understand Christianity, are often surprised by the actual content of the Bible, of Jesus' sermons, and it's refreshing to tell people, but it's also sometimes disappointing to see how little people know. So we have to be present, especially on the internet, where a lot of people spend a lot of time, more time than they spend anywhere else, unfortunately,
Right.
in our day, to have that conversation here because people are here.
Very good. Very good. I appreciate that.
Yeah. Thanks so much for coming on.
Mhm.
If anyone wants to support Forward in Faith, there's a website. The link should be in the description. If you want to support this show, you can always do so over at younganglican.locals.com. Otherwise, if you liked the video, like the video, subscribe to the channel if you want to see more. Thank you so much for watching, and God bless.
Thank you.